Most people who grew up watching Legend remember it as a beautiful film that didn't quite work, stunning to look at, something slightly off underneath, and a story that never fully arrived. What they don't know is that the film they watched was missing 40 minutes, not trimmed, gutted, and the version that does work, the one Ridley Scott actually finished, sat locked away for 17 years, while an inferior cut shaped an entire generation's relationship with one of the most visually ambitious fantasy films ever made. That changes today. Welcome back, I'm Sam. What happened to Legend between its European premiere and its American release is one of the most complete acts of studio dismantling in 1980s cinema. 40 minutes cut, an entire original score discarded and replaced, a female character's corruption arc, the dramatic engine that made the whole story work softened until it barely existed. What Universal delivered to American audiences in 1985 was not a different version of Ridley Scott's film. It was a different film. In this video, we are going inside both cuts, what Scott built, what the studio took apart, and why the director's cut, finally released in 2002, doesn't just improve this film, it reveals it. By 1985, Ridley Scott had made Alien and Blade Runner, two films that arrived misunderstood, underperformed commercially, and are now foundational texts of modern cinema. If you know that pattern, what happened to Legend is not a surprise, it is a continuation. What Scott wanted to make was a fairy tale in the oldest sense, not a children's story, but the kind of dark, morally ambiguous myth that fairy tales were before the 19th century made them safe. A world where beauty and menace were inseparable, where the darkness had its own logic, its own pull, its own claim on the characters. The production assembled to realize that vision was extraordinary. The sets built at Pinewood were among the most elaborate practical environments ever constructed for a fantasy film, vast, handmade, and staggeringly detailed. Rob Bottin's work on Tim Curry's Darkness remains some of the most ambitious practical effects makeup in cinema history, a performance built from the outside in that required months of construction before Curry had taken a single step on set. Jerry Goldsmith were brought in to score the film atmospheric, strange, and deliberately uncomfortable in its beauty, and at the center of the story was Lily, not as decoration, not as the reward at the end of the quest, but as the reason the catastrophe happens at all. Her curiosity is what draws the unicorns into danger. Her corruption is what drives the second half of the film. Without her arc holding together, Legend has no dramatic engine. The studio saw the early cuts and got nervous. The film was slow, strange, and resistant to easy categorization. American test audiences, primed for the kind of fantasy adventure that had dominated the decade, didn't know what to do with it. And Universal decided that what Scott had made needed to be rebuilt before anyone outside of Europe would see it. What followed was a post-production process that functioned less like editing and more like demolition. If you want more deep dives into the films that got taken apart, the cuts that were changed, the visions that were buried, and the stories behind what ended up on screen, subscribe and like this video. 40 minutes of footage was cut, not tightened, not restructured, but removed. Goldsmith's score that Scott had built the film's atmosphere around was replaced entirely by Tangerine Dream orchestral score that was, by any fair measure, more immediately accessible and completely wrong for what was on screen. Sequences that had been establishing the internal logic of this world, developing Lily's arc through its most critical stages, and giving the film its sense of genuine strangeness were gone before American audiences bought their first ticket. The consequence was not simply a shorter film, it was a film whose architecture had been removed. Scenes were now building toward moments that no longer existed. Decisions characters made had lost the context that made them credible. The tonal register Scott had spent months calibrating the specific feeling of beauty threaded through with unease was replaced, scene by scene, with something brighter and more insistent. Play any scene from the director's cut alongside the same scene from the theatrical cut, and the score replacement alone makes the argument.
I meant no wrong.
The images are identical, the experience is not remotely the same. Goldsmith's orchestral score moves, with the darkness ancient, weighted, exactly what the story demands. Tangerine Dream's replacement is atmospheric but detached, pulling the film toward pop fantasy when Scott was reaching for myth. Same footage, completely different film. The most specific and most damaging evidence of what the studio interference cost is, not in the runtime or the score. It is in what happens to Lily. In Scott's cut, Lily's movement toward darkness is gradual and psychologically credible. The black dress sequence is not a temptation she brushes off. It is the beginning of a genuine transformation that plays out across the film's second half. By the time she is dancing with darkness, the audience has watched her get there, step by step, and they believe she might not come back. That belief is what makes Legend genuinely tense, because a villain whose power is seduction is only frightening if the person being seduced is actually in danger of being won over. The theatrical cut removes the arc in stages, shortening some scenes, cutting others entirely, until what remains is a character who appears to be in danger but never appears to be truly tempted. She is a victim, not a participant. And that distinction destroys the film's moral complexity at its root. Which means Tim Curry's Darkness, a performance of extraordinary physical commitment built across months of prosthetic work and delivered with a controlled, magnetic menace, is performing into a vacuum. The theatrical cut gives him no counterpart. His power has nowhere to land. The greatest practical effects performance of that decade is stranded in a film that cut out the only thing it needed to work. The studio removed a female character's darkness because test audiences found it uncomfortable. In doing so, they didn't just damage her arc, they removed the reason the film existed. The US theatrical cut and the director's cut of Legend are not a long version and a short version of the same film. They have different tones, different pacing, different internal logic, different emotional destinations, and because of the score replacement, they are completely different sensory experiences from the first frame to the last. The unicorn sequence that opens the story demonstrates this within the first 10 minutes. In Scott's version, it is slow, strange, and suffused, with a quality of sacred menace. The beauty of the creatures and the danger they carry are impossible to separate. Goldsmith's orchestral score makes the scene feel genuinely ancient and weighted. In the theatrical cut, the Tangerine Dream score gives the same images a synthesized, dreamlike quality that softens the menace before the story has properly begun. The endings diverge even further. In the director's cut, Scott closes on ambiguity. Jack and Lily go their separate ways, the darkness retreats, but the world is not fully restored, and the final frames carry an unease appropriate for a myth about the permanence of evil. The theatrical cut resolves this cleanly. The hero and girl walk off together, the darkness conclusively defeated. It is a more comfortable ending and a considerably less honest one. Universal did not make a rough cut of Ridley Scott's film more commercial. They made a different film, then they released it under his name. The director's cut arrived in 2002, 17 years after the theatrical release. What is remarkable about it is not that it feels like a new film, it feels like the film that was always there, buried under the version most people knew and couldn't quite love. Critics who had filed Legend away as a beautiful misfire found something with genuine depth. The film had not changed, their access to it had, and the gap between what it was and what it had been allowed to be for 17 years is the most honest measure of the damage that was done. Scott has been direct. The theatrical cut is not his film. After watching both versions closely, the only reasonable response is to take him at his word and to recognize that what he is describing is not an artist being precious about a compromise. It is a director pointing at the difference between a vision and its demolition. Legend is not a story about a film that almost worked. It is a story about a film that did work, that was finished, complete, and coherent, and was then taken apart by people who were afraid of what it was. The theatrical cut is the fear. The director's cut is the film. If you have only ever seen the theatrical cut, you have not seen this film. Watch the director's cut, watch the black dress scene, play out in full, watch Lily move towards something she can't entirely refuse, and watch what Tim Curry does when he finally has a counterpart worthy of that performance. Then ask yourself what else might be sitting in a studio vault somewhere, finished and complete, waiting 17 years for someone to decide it's finally safe enough to be seen. If you want more deep dives into the films that got taken apart, the cuts that were changed, the visions that were buried, and the stories behind what ended up on screen, subscribe. There's more coming. Thanks for watching.